It began on a cold January afternoon in New York City. A dim lamp glowed in a Soho loft, casting a thin circle of light over an unmade bed, a few scattered pages of a script, and 6 prescription bottles lined neatly on a wooden nightstand. Outside, the city moved with its usual indifference. Inside, something had already gone quiet. A 28-year-old actor lay face down on the sheets as if he had simply collapsed into the sleep he had been chasing for months. The room was still, not tragic, not chaotic, simply still. The only clues of what had been happening inside his mind were a worn notebook filled with strange sketches and phrases, and a recent trail of exhausted days that no one fully understood at the time. Hours earlier, he had spoken about getting back to work. He had appointments scheduled. He had plans. Yet by mid-afternoon, the people who came to see him found a silence that felt wrong the second they stepped through the door. The first paramedic who entered the room later said that it looked like a man who had fought a long battle against his own exhaustion and finally lost, not dramatically, not intentionally, quietly. For months he had been trying to sleep. For years he had been carrying more weight than anyone knew. And for one final night, he was alone with the consequences of that invisible struggle. By the time the world learned his name again, the headlines had already chosen their story. But the truth of what happened in that room and the story of the man who arrived there was far more complicated. And this was only the beginning. Before the headlines, before the awards, before the world started speaking his name with the reverence reserved for legends, Heath Andrew Ledger was just a boy growing up on the far western edge of Australia. Born on April 4, 1979, in the quiet city of Perth, he came into a world that felt too small for the magnitude he would one day carry. His mother, Sally, taught French. His father, Kim, worked in engineering and the motor racing business. The Ledger household was ordinary, stable, predictable. Nothing in it suggested a future Hollywood icon. But even in childhood, Heath was drawn to things that required unusual depths of imagination. His sister Kate, older, confident, already performing in school plays, was his first doorway into storytelling. When Heath stepped on stage at age 10 to play Peter Pan, something inside him shifted. Performance didn't feel like pretending to him. It felt like entering a place where he finally made sense. At school, he was quiet, thoughtful, and often lost in his own world. While other boys chased sports or noise, he spent hours over a chessboard, studying patterns, learning how to read people through their choices. Perth was a city surrounded by ocean, separated from the rest of Australia by thousands of miles of open land. It had its own pace, its own silence. And for a mind that moved as fast as Heath's, it was both sanctuary and confinement. By the time he reached 16, that internal restlessness had grown too large to ignore. He took his final exams early, not because he wanted to leave his childhood behind, but because he felt that staying meant shrinking. With a close friend, Trevor DiCarlo, he packed his belongings into an old car and began a 3,000-kilometer journey across the continent to Sydney. No clear plan, no agent waiting for him, just ambition, raw and unpolished, pushing him forward. Sydney was loud, crowded, unpredictable. Everything Perth wasn't. Heath took any work he could find. Small roles in television programs like Sweat, Home and Away, and Ship to Shore. These were not glamorous jobs. They didn't pay well. They didn't promise a future. But each one was a step, a quiet declaration that he was willing to start from nothing. What set him apart wasn't fame or natural ease in front of the camera. It was discipline. He studied scripts obsessively. He learned to observe people with the same attention he once gave to chess pieces. He watched the emotional details that others overlooked. The way someone's voice softened when they lied, or the way their shoulders tightened when they hid something. Acting to Heath was not the art of pretending. It was the art of noticing. By the late 1990s, Australian cinema was gaining international attention. Directors in Los Angeles were watching, casting directors were scouting, and Heath Ledger, barely 20, happened to be rising just as Hollywood began looking toward the Pacific for new talent. His breakthrough came not as a dramatic role, but as the rebellious, charismatic outsider in Tense Things I Hate About You, 1999. The film was light, funny, romantic. The kind of story thousands of young actors hope will open doors. It opened doors for Heath, big ones. Suddenly, Hollywood saw him as the next heartthrob. Studios sent him scripts filled with charming smiles and predictable love stories. The safe path, the profitable path, the path that would have made him famous fast. He turned almost all of them down. From the beginning, Heath rejected the idea of becoming a packaged celebrity. He wanted roles that felt alive, that scared him, that required something uncomfortable. To him, art was supposed to challenge. It wasn't meant to flatter the audience, and it wasn't meant to protect the actor. Instead of settling into romantic comedies, he chose films like Two Hands, The Patriot, Monsters Ball, and Ned Kelly. Each role chipped away at the image Hollywood tried to put on him. Each one revealed a little more of the depth that people around him sensed but couldn't quite describe. But it was Brokeback Mountain in 2005 that marked his true arrival. As the emotionally repressed cowboy Ennis Del Mar, Heath carried entire scenes with silence alone. A tightened jaw, averted eyes, a voice that trembled only when the truth became too heavy to bear. The world finally saw what he'd been building since childhood. A performance that did not seek applause, but demanded respect. The film earned him an Academy Award nomination. It changed his career. It changed how directors saw him, and it changed how he saw himself. Yet beneath that rising brilliance, something else was forming. A quiet fatigue, a tension between the demands of the industry and the intensity with which he approached each role. A pattern of mental strain that no one recognized as dangerous. Not yet. Heath Ledger had stepped onto the world stage. The ascent had begun, and in its shadow, the first signs of the fall were already waiting. In 2002, Heath Ledger entered a new stage of his career. Hollywood had begun to understand that he was not a decorative face, but a force waiting to be used correctly. He approached every role as if it were a puzzle only he could solve, breaking characters down to their smallest details, refusing shortcuts, refusing anything that felt too easy. By 2003, offers were coming in steadily. Ned Kelly placed him at the center of Australian folklore, while The Patriot and Monsters Ball showed that he could stand next to major stars and still command the frame. What audiences didn't see was how he prepared. Long nights spent alone with scripts, scribbling notes in the margins, absorbing the emotional temperature of each character until his own body reflected it. Friends said he carried roles with him like shadows. In 2004 and 2005, something shifted. Heath became restless again. The same restlessness that once pushed a 16-year-old boy out of Perth. He felt boxed in by Hollywood's expectations. He wanted complexity, contradiction, pain. And then came the role that gave him everything he asked for. Ennis Del Mar in Brokeback Mountain. In 2005, during the film's 8-month production, Heath transformed. He built Ennis from silence rather than words. He studied the way men from rural Wyoming walked, how they held grief in their shoulders, how they spoke only when absolutely necessary. His jaw stayed clenched for weeks at a time, a physical choice that shaped Ennis's entire emotional landscape. When the film premiered, critics called his performance devastating. It earned him an Academy Award nomination and redefined him in the eyes of the industry. But the success carried a hidden cost. Heath was suddenly in demand everywhere. Interviews, press tours, industry dinners. Endless cycles that drained someone who had always been more comfortable in quiet rooms than under bright lights. At the same time, he was adjusting to fatherhood, determined to be present for his daughter even when his schedule made it nearly impossible. Still, he kept saying yes to roles that required more and more from him. Then, in late 2006, fate intervened in the form of a meeting with Christopher Nolan. The director was preparing the sequel to Batman Begins and searching for someone to reinvent the Joker, not as a comic book caricature, but as something darker, sharper, and more psychologically unsettling. Many actors were considered. None felt right. They spoke about chaos, about unpredictability, about villains who didn't seek power but disruption. Heath understood instantly. He didn't audition, he didn't need to. Nolan offered him the role based on instinct alone. In early 2007, Heath Ledger became the Joker, and the ascent turned into a climb that pushed him past the limits of what his body and mind could endure. To prepare, Heath rented a room in a London hotel and isolated himself for nearly 6 weeks. He filled notebooks with distorted sketches, clipped newspaper articles about violence, and wrote lines in jagged handwriting that later appeared in the Joker's on-screen persona. He experimented with voices until he found one that sounded playfully cruel, like a child imitating evil without fully understanding it. He developed the Joker's laugh. Not one laugh, but a collection of them, each tailored to specific moments. By the time filming began, Heath was unrecognizable. On set, he stayed in character. He moved unpredictably. He leaned forward at unsettling angles. His eyes flickered with something between mischief and menace. Crew members later said that Heath didn't act the Joker, he inhabited him. Christopher Nolan described it as watching a performance that pulled the air out of the room. But behind the brilliance, a quiet fracture was forming. The shoot was demanding. Long nights, high-intensity scenes, constant adrenaline. And Heath's childhood struggle followed him into adulthood. Insomnia. He talked in interviews about his mind refusing to shut off. Even after filming ended, he said he slept only 2 hours a night. He took prescribed sleeping pills to help. Sometimes they worked, often they didn't. Yet the film continued, and Heath continued with it. In the summer and fall of 2007, he juggled the final months of The Dark Knight with the start of the Imaginarium of Dr. Parnassus. His schedule became a relentless cycle of travel, filming, physical strain, and emotional depth. By the end of the year, he appeared noticeably thinner, his eyes darker, his movements slower. He joked about being exhausted, but the exhaustion had begun to erode him from the inside. What no one realized, not friends, not coworkers, not even Heath himself, was that he was climbing one of the steepest artistic peaks any actor had attempted in years. And he was climbing it without rest, without pause, without the sleep he desperately needed. The performance that would define him was almost complete. The price he was paying for it was just beginning. But brilliance doesn't protect anyone, and ambition doesn't heal a mind that has gone too long without rest. January 2008 arrived like the final chapter of a book that had been writing itself for years. Heath Ledger was in New York, living temporarily in a loft on Broome Street while working on the Imaginarium of Dr. Parnassus. The winter was brutal. Wind cut through the streets, snow lined the sidewalks, and Heath, already depleted from months of insomnia, was fighting a chest infection that left him coughing through the night. On January 20th, he told his family he felt unwell, exhausted, unable to sleep. Doctors had prescribed antibiotics and mild pain medications. These added to the sleeping pills he already relied on. Each bottle was legitimate, each dosage medically approved, but together they formed a delicate chemistry that only a fully rested body could withstand. Heath's body was anything but rested. On January 21st, he went to a photo shoot. Witnesses later described him as warm but noticeably drained, with a lingering heaviness around his eyes. He spoke about returning to London soon. He had scenes to complete. He had plans for the weeks ahead. The exhaustion was visible, but the intention to keep going was stronger. And then came January 22nd, 2008. The morning passed quietly. A housekeeper arrived. A massage therapist was scheduled for the afternoon. Heath had been working on a script earlier. A few pages lay open on the floor of his bedroom. His notebook, the same one he often filled during roles, sat beside it. Nothing in the loft suggested chaos. No overturned furniture, no signs of panic. Just the ordinary disorder of a man living between two film sets. Around 3 p.m., the therapist entered his room. Heath was lying face down on the bed, still as if he had surrendered mid-breath to the sleep he had chased for so many nights. She called his name. No response. She shook him gently. Nothing. The silence felt wrong in a way that people only understand when something irreversible has already happened. She called for help. Paramedics rushed into the loft. They attempted to revive him. They tried for several minutes, but he was gone. The news broke within the hour. An actor at the height of his career, a father of a 2-year-old girl, a man whose performance as the Joker had already become a whispering legend in industry circles. Dead at 28, the city froze. Hollywood froze. The internet exploded. In the absence of facts, speculation filled the gaps. Some said he overdosed on illegal drugs. He didn't. Some said he took his own life. He didn't. Others claimed the Joker had driven him mad, as if genius came with a supernatural curse. The truth was colder, quieter, and infinitely more human. Weeks later, when the medical examiner released the toxicology report, the cause became clear. Accidental acute intoxication from a combination of prescription medications: oxycodone, hydrocodone, diazepam, temazepam, alprazolam, and doxylamine. Medications millions of people take. Medications meant to ease pain, calm anxiety, and help him sleep. Medications that individually pose little danger, but together overwhelmed a body that had been pushed far beyond its limits. It was not suicide. It was not self-destruction. It was exhaustion weaponized by chemistry. The tabloids didn't care. The myth was too seductive. They preferred the narrative of a man consumed by his own brilliance. They printed headlines about the Joker's curse, ignoring the quieter reality of a young father trying to rest in a world that never allowed him to slow down. But those who truly knew Heath spoke differently. They remembered a gentle man, a curious man, a man who laughed easily, loved deeply, and was often overwhelmed not by madness, but by pressure. The pressure to challenge himself, to evolve, to be more than what Hollywood expected. There was no villain in that room, no dramatic farewell, no grotesque crime scene, just a bed, a few scattered pills, and a man who had been tired for far too long. When investigators cleared the doctors who had prescribed his medications, another question quietly emerged. How does someone so loved, so admired, so undeniably gifted slip through the cracks so completely that the world only realizes the danger when it's too late? The answer lay in a truth no headline could sell. Heath Ledger didn't die because he played the Joker. And the moment that truth reached millions, the tragedy was already complete. In the hours after Heath Ledger's death, New York became strangely still. News vans crowded the narrow Soho street. Reporters whispered into microphones as if volume alone might disturb the truth. Fans gathered behind the barricades, some in disbelief, some in tears, most trying to understand how someone so vividly alive could vanish so suddenly. By January 23, 2008, the story had made its way around the globe. In Australia, morning programs replayed old interviews of Heath, the softness in his voice, the earnestness of his eyes, the quiet pride he carried for his roots. In Perth, bouquets accumulated outside the Ledger family home. Locals who remembered him as a shy boy at Guildford Grammar School placed handwritten notes under the flowers. To them, Heath wasn't a Hollywood star. He was the city's son who had climbed higher than anyone imagined. But in America, the narrative fractured quickly. When the toxicology report came out and confirmed the death was accidental, some media outlets corrected their speculation. Others doubled down on the sensationalism. They insisted the Joker had taken Heath, turning a nuanced tragedy into a supernatural fable. It was easier for tabloids to treat him like a myth than a man. Yet behind the noise, something profound was happening. Christopher Nolan and the team behind The Dark Knight faced a dilemma that few filmmakers ever confront: how to honor a masterpiece created by someone who would never see it finished. Warner Brothers wanted to push forward with promotion, but Nolan refused to exploit Heath's death. He made it clear the film would speak for itself and that Heath's performance would be treated with dignity, not as marketing fuel. When The Dark Knight premiered on July 14, 2008, the absence of Heath Ledger was palpable. His presence filled every frame, and yet he was nowhere to be found. In theaters around the world, audiences watched the Joker enter the screen and felt a collective jolt. It wasn't just a performance. It was something alive, something dangerous, magnetic, unsettling. Heath had transformed chaos into art, and then a second wave of shock arrived, not because he was brilliant, but because he had never seen what he'd created. The film shattered box office records, eventually crossing the $1 billion mark globally. Critics called his performance the greatest screen villain of modern cinema. Fans uploaded tributes online. Interviews from cast and crew surfaced, each describing Heath with a tenderness that clashed with the violent caricature the tabloids had painted. In early 2009, as awards season approached, Heath Ledger's name became a fixture on nomination lists. At the Golden Globes, he won Best Supporting Actor. At the BAFTAs, he won again. Each ceremony carried a strange heaviness, applause mixed with grief, celebration blended with loss, but nothing compared to the Academy Awards on February 22, 2009. When Heath's name was announced as the winner of the Oscar for Best Supporting Actor, the entire room rose to its feet. His parents and sister walked onto the stage, not with theatrics or tears, but with quiet dignity. They spoke about the man behind the makeup, the father, the brother, the son, and the world saw, for the first time on a global stage, the human being behind the myth. Yet the most lasting consequence of Heath's death wasn't the awards. It was the conversation that began because of it. Actors started speaking openly about mental strain, insomnia, and the pressure to disappear into roles. Directors reconsidered the demands they placed on performers. Studios quietly adjusted guidelines for on-set support. Heath never intended to become a cautionary tale, but he became a mirror, one that reflected uncomfortable truths about the industry's relentless pace and its quiet normalization of exhaustion. Fans mourned differently. Some revisited his earlier films and found new layers they hadn't noticed before. Others studied his interviews, searching for hints of the burden he carried. Many simply left messages online thanking him for giving them characters that felt real, fractured, and profoundly human. Years passed, the rumors faded, the conspiracies lost their shine, but Heath Ledger's impact didn't disappear. It persisted in the standard he set for comic book villains, in the way young actors approach character work, in the awareness of how fragile the line is between dedication and self-destruction. Heath's life ended abruptly in a quiet room in Soho, but what followed, the grieving, the reflection, the conversations, became a form of resurrection. Not of the man himself, but of the truth he left behind. His final tragedy forced the world to confront what it had overlooked, and the legacy that emerged from that reckoning became larger than anything he created on screen. When the noise faded, when the headlines moved on, and the world returned to its usual rhythm, Heath Ledger remained, not as a tragedy, but as a reminder of what brilliance looks like when it burns too intensely to last. His legacy outlived the rumors, outlived the speculation, outlived every convenient narrative that tried to explain his absence. What remained was the work, and the work was undeniable. Every generation of actors since has measured depth against the standard he set. Directors still speak of his instinct, his fearlessness, his willingness to surrender completely to a role without losing the honesty that made his performances feel alive. Fans revisit The Dark Knight not because the Joker is iconic, but because Heath infused him with something unsettlingly human. In interviews years later, Christopher Nolan said that Heath left behind a light no one else could cast. It was not the light of fame or success, but the light of someone who understood that art mattered, even when it came at a cost. The final image of Heath for many is not the Joker's painted smile, but a quieter one, a candid photograph, head slightly bowed, eyes soft, unaware of the mythology his future would become. It is the image of a man who gave more than he had, not out of recklessness, but out of devotion. Hollywood forgets quickly, but some stories refuse to fade. Heath Ledger's story is one of them.